First of all, I'd like to welcome all the Sangha members from the monasteries, nunneries in India, Nepal, and Bhutan, and as well as all of my Dharma, male and female Dharma friends from the Dharma centers and watching over the internet, and in particular, all of those who are watching in China and in the Tibetan regions. I would like to offer you all a warm greetings. Now, yesterday we spoke about the 6 Orthodox Hindu schools. I gave a brief introduction to them. So today what I would like to introduce are the other views and schools that developed other than just those 6 Orthodox schools. So that is what I'll present today. So now we are speaking again about the non-Buddhists. And so today we will finish speaking about the various different Brahmanical traditions. And so tomorrow I will begin speaking about the Buddhist tradition. Now, during the time of the Buddha, there are basically 2 different types of Dharma practice. Now, one of these were the practitioners were called the Brahmanas, and the second was called the Shramana. Now, if we translate that into English, means spiritual practitioners. So there were 2 different types of people who followed religions. So and among them, those who followed the tradition religions or the Vedic religions were called the Brahmanas. And they primarily had faith in the Vedas and the Dharma of the Vedas. Now, all those who practiced different styles of Dharma and the other types of religions, they were called the Shramanas. Now, the meaning of the word Shramana, if we translate it into Tibetan, means someone who's making effort, someone who's training. So the Tibetan translators and translated again to Tibetan, translated as training and virtue. So now, these are people who practice Dharma in a different way than was taught in the Upanishads. And the way they did this is they would leave their home, they would live on alms, so they'd immediately live a wandering life. They would not stay in any fixed place. They wouldn't stay in one place for long. They'd wander into many different countries and lands. And most of these who live the wandering life of an ascetic would, from a young age, they would give up all the opportunities that come with living home and the pleasures of a home. And they would go to the forest and they would practice yoga or undergo severe asceticism. And they would do this as a method to give meaning to their human life or to achieve the state of liberation. Now, those who are practicing this, the Shramana tradition, the reason why there are people who practice in this way, the reason why this occurred is that there are many differences in the way that people thought at that time. And so, because there's so many different views, and I think there's such a big change. And so, because related with these great changes in thinking, I think that helped this develop. Now, another issue, a practical issue that we need to explain is that food is plentiful in the central regions of India. And so there wasn't much difficulty with food and drink. So there was no difficulty in getting food and drink. But India is a very hot country. And so if you don't eat the food, then it goes bad quickly. So once food has been cooked, the leftovers were just in general that had to be thrown out. There's no choice but to throw them out, because after a day or two, they would go bad and be inedible. So in general, they would just throw out the leftover food. But there are so many people who practice the shramana, the spiritual dharma, living on alms. And so there is someone to whom the householders could give the alms. And so for this reason, all those who went forth and lived on alms were never deprived of alms. They would go on their alms rounds, and people would give food to them without any stinginess and without any reservations, and so they never had any problems living on alms. And so it was easy for the people living on alms to wander from country to country, and living on alms. So sometimes we speak about this as the wandering lifestyle, the wandering ascetic, the paribhajaka, as being kind of a new way of life. But actually, this lifestyle of wandering lifestyle, living, going forth and living, going forth and wandering was much easier. So there's more excitement and interest in doing this. So even people who came from families with good situations, prosperous families, so even the children of such families would give up or would forget about the good situation in their family and go off, and they'd live on donors' food. And they took great interest, and they took up the search for the true nature. And so they put a lot of effort into this. And so this is a new tradition that developed at that time. Now, if we look at it from one perspective, during the age of philosophy, there are many different philosophies that did develop, as we don't need to mention. But among the ones that developed at that time, the ones whose scriptures are still extant or still with us are the 6 Orthodox Hindu schools we spoke about yesterday, and then Buddhism and Jainism. But other than them, there are not many texts remaining for the other religious traditions of that time. And all those people who, the researchers into Indian Indology, research Indian history and Indian thought, have great regard for the texts of the 6 Orthodox schools. And because they can learn a lot about the situation and the events in India at that time from these. And so researchers have and so they would you look at these examples, look at these texts from many different angles with different techniques. And so there is also this name of these 6 Orthodox schools is a name that is given recently by these scholars to these schools. they have looked at all the different schools that developed in India, and they've sort of brought out the ones that are more prominent and given them this name of the six Orthodox schools. And so they had this wish to name these schools, and they gave them that name, the six Orthodox schools, the six darshanas. But one thing we need to understand is that at that time, to the age of philosophy, if we were to say, were there only the six Hindu schools and none others? It's not that. There were many schools. The old Buddhist scriptures say that there are 95 different views, and there are people who upheld these 95 different views. Or we also have talked about the 62 wrong views. There are the people who upheld the 62 wrong views. When we speak about that, if we're looking for a reliable source to describe the 95 views, when researchers examine, investigate, they to get as many of the texts from that time they can and look for as many sources they can, and use them because they're a valuable source. But they haven't found any manuscript that they think is a reliable source for these 92 different views. And so for that reason, it's difficult to explain what they are. However, the 62 wrong views do have a source. And the reason we can say this is there is a sutra called the Brahma's Web Sutra, or the Brahmajala Sutta. It's called the Brahmajala Suttanta. It's this text called the Sutra. It's the Brahma's Web Sutra, the Brahmajala Suttanta. It's a Buddhist text. And all the 62 views are mentioned in this in an overall fashion. So we can take this sutra, the Brahma's Web Sutra, as a source and give a basic description of the 62 views. Now this Brahma's Web Sutra is, so we have the three Pitakas, and so these are the three texts. Now there's a section of them is called the Long Discourses. Now it's not in the Tibetan, but it's a very important text. But the researchers who are investigating original Buddhism, we use this as a great source for the teachings of original Buddhism, but it is not available in Tibetan. It is in Chinese, and is also in the Pali-Caye, the southern Buddhist traditions. In any case, there is this Brahma's Web Sutra is one section of the Long Discourses. And so this is a sutra that is also in both the southern and the northern traditions. So, and there's no other source that is a better source on the 62 different views. And so for that reason, if we're researching the 62 different views, we then this Brahma's Web Sutra is a very valuable and important resource. Now, I've looked at it. I've done a little bit of research. In Tibetan, we do, I believe, have a sutra called the Brahma's Web Sutra. In the Tibetan Khandron, within the section on sutras, there's a sutra called the Brahma's Web Sutra. Now, there's so many different sutras in our sutra section. There are sutras from the Foundation Vehicle and the Mahayana Sutra, and they're basically all thrown together. They're all just put in there without any making decisions. They weren't divided into sessions. They were all put in there. So within the sutras, there are many Foundation Vehicle views. There are many Shravaka Vehicle Foundation Vehicle Sutras, as well as Mahayana Sutras, and there are sutras from the Pali language. And so there is a sutra called the Brahmaswab Sutra in there. And it does include the 62 vows. And so probably the Brahmaswab Sutra in the long discourses is probably available in Tibetan, but we just haven't taken any interest in it. And if we look at that, no, I didn't have the time to really compare it in detail, but if I looked at it and thought it is basically the same. So when we look at this, we can see that in the southern tradition, the northern tradition, and the Tibetan traditions, there is this Brahmaswab Sutra. So it is a very reliable source. So now I'd like to give a basic introduction to the 62 different views taught in the Brahmaswab Sutra. And these 62 views are divided into two sections. These two are first the 18 views considering the beginning of the universe and 44 views about the end. And if you add these two, you have a total of 62 views. So first, I'd like to give an introduction to the 18 views about the beginning. So the first one, so among the four wrong views about the beginning, there are many different ones. There are the four eternalist views and so forth. And so we've talked about what are the four eternalist views? Four eternalist views are like this. The non-Buddhas would also practice dhyana. They practice shamatha meditation. And through practicing this dhyana, they would develop the clairvoyance of remembering past lives. And when they develop this clairvoyance, they would look with their clairvoyance and look to see where were the sentient beings from many eons ago now. And when they look at these, they'd see that the sentient beings would go from one lifetime to the next, from one place to the next, and go in a continuum. And they would see this. When they saw this, they thought, well, sentient beings would go from one life to the next. They never cease from unto the end. And so there's the continuum or the continuum of the sentient being, the continuum of the self is permanent. That it is never interrupted. And they say that as they say, what it says is, when I look to see where that person who from 20 kalpas, eons ago was born, where is he now? When they know it, when they look at and they see and they know and they see that that the continuum of the person is eternal and permanent. And so for that reason, the self is permanent. Sentient beings are permanent, they say. And so they had the feeling that this was so. So this is one view. They see the sentients who are passing from one to the next. They see that the sentient beings are still there, and say they're internal. Now, why there are four different views? Because the number of eons. So they divide in terms of the people who saw it 20 eons ago or 40 eons ago and so forth. So they divided into four by the view, or by the length of time. And there are four views of some beings being internal. This is because there are beings who are born in the retinue of great Obama, and then they're reborn as humans. And when they are born as human, they practice shamatha, and then they develop the jhanas and develop clairvoyance. And then they remember that they were in the retinue of great Brahma. And they think, well, where is great Brahma? their lord had been great Brahma, and so they looked to see. You see that great Brahma was still there as he had been before; he had not died. So their own leader, great Brahma, was still there, and said that, oh, there he must be eternal. He never dies. He must be impermanent. So great Brahma is permanent, but his emanations are everything that's created, because they say that Brahma is the creator. They say all of us are impermanent. They say, and so this is divided into four because those who had been in Brahma's retinues, if they're born among the if they're born in the six realm types of gods of the desire realm gods, they could look with the samadhi and see where are born and see where they've continued. And so in this way, they have this eternalist view that develops. And so this isn't to say the view of some beings, but it's saying that some beings are eternal and unchanging and that they're still there. And so that's the thought. Now, the third type of view is whether the infinite or not infinite. So now that there are four different views of the infinite or not infinite. And what this means, infinite or not infinite, so these non-Buddhists who have clairvoyance, the non-Buddhist sages who have clairvoyant powers, when they look to see, is there an end of the world realm or not? So when they look at, when they see the ages of the destruction of the universe, when they see the way the universe is destroyed, and they see it as if the same way we think with our eyes, they see this age of destruction, they say that it's finite, there is an end. Sometimes they look at the ages of formation, and when they see that there's a formation, they think there is no end. It is infinite. They're not able to see everything, right? They can't see the whole picture. They can't see the entire situation of the entire world. But when they see part of it, then sometimes that it seems like the world has an end. When they see the world has an age of destruction, they think the world has an end. When they see an age of formation, say that the world has no end, that it is infinite. Likewise, they would look up. They would look up. Is there an end up or below? When they look down to the helms, and it's like that there's an end. And so they think there's a finite end. So when they see the hells, they think that there's a finite end. So they look above and below and so forth. When they're looking up and above, they think that there's an end. But when they're looking straight ahead, when they're looking straight without going up and down, then they think that there's no end, that it's infinite. And so their views about so these different their ideas of the world being both finite or infinite. And then there are the four who will not give up the gods. Now these are people who have a very deceptive way of thinking. Because if they'd ask, is there a result of virtue or not, or whether the word is whether virtue will bring a result or misdeeds will bring a result, does the word have an end or not? What is good or virtue? As perhaps it is on from one perspective, they don't have experience, and another aspect is they have pride. And they look at it and they don't give an answer to that. Instead of giving an answer, they say, I'm not giving up on the dogs. I'm not going to deny the gods. And say words like this. And so they would be deceptive and not answer directly. And so this, the four views. Now, then there is this denial of cause. This is the fifth, the denial of cause. So there are two types of denials of cause. There are those who develop do this arise from dhyana meditation, and those who do it from speculation and logical thought. So those from dhyana, when they accomplish samadhi and look with clairvoyance, they don't see an earlier the previous cause. And because they don't see the preceding cause, they think that the body and the mind arise from chance or spontaneously. And so these are the denials of cause. So those are the 18 views about a beginning. And so those are people who are thinking about the past and the present, about the present and the past. And so because that's what they're primarily thinking about, they're got the 18 views about a beginning. Then there are the 48 wrong views about an end. And the first of these are, say, they have ideas about the future. So when you talk about the future, you said people who say they have ideas about the future, when they think about what's going to happen in the future, it's the idea that in the future, when I take another birth, I'm going to have a body and a mind together. And not only going to have a mind, there's those who think that. Then there are people who think that I'll have a mind but not a body. That's a second. The idea that have both, and then there'll be the idea that they have neither a body nor a mind. So there's four alternatives. And then there's the idea that the self has an end or it does not have end, that has both an end, it does not have an end, or that neither has an that is neither. And so then there are four. And then there's the idea that in the future that the self, that I will have pleasure or will experience suffering, or that I'll experience both pleasure and suffering, or the idea that I experience neither pleasure nor suffering. So those are four. And then there are the ideas that the Bhav is self, or that it's separate, or that it's small, or that it's immeasurable. And so these are different ideas. If you add those all up, those are the 16 of those who say that have eyes. People who say that they're going to have ideas, that they have the idea that their conception is, or their consciousness is going to continue. And so these different ways of asserting this. And those who say that they're going to arise without any conception. So the idea is the same. So it's the idea that I will have a body but not a mind. So this is another thought that arises. And then the rest is the same, whether there's an end to the self or not. So they say that there's no conception at that time. And then there are those who would not say that they both either have or do not have conceptions. Basically, you have a conception or not have a conception, or that you have both or neither. And so that is another. And there are also those who explain it that way. And so then there are 8 for those. Then there are 7 views of annihilation. This means the humans and gods of desire, the gods in the form, and the gods in the 4 levels of formless, that once they die, they're going to be done, and then that's done. They're annihilated, and there's no future lives. And so when you die, then this continuum ceases. So there's 7 types of explanations of that. And then the 10th is those who say they're liberated in this lifetime. It's not just saying that this life, it's not just the idea of achieving liberation, but it's not just this. It also includes those who say that they can have unrestrained enjoyment of the sensory pleasures. They don't need to give up the sensory pleasures. Then there are people who say that they'll achieve liberation in the 1st jhana, or the 2nd jhana, 3rd jhana, and so forth, up to the 4th jhana. And thinking that if they've achieved each of those samadhis, then they think that they will achieve liberation. And so in this way, there are these 5 different traditions. So this is a basic an overview of these different types of views. And what we need to take a look with these 62 different views Among those, there are people, there are the people with the digestive view who are unable to give an answer, who won't give an answer, who said, I'm not going to give up them. So there are these people who are giving the deceptive answers. And then there are people who have no cause. Then there's the view of annihilation, the nihilistic view. And then there are those who say that they're achieve liberation in this lifetime. And so there are these different views are very similar to the six teachers whom I'll speak about next. And so that's something that we also need to keep in mind, take interest in. Now I'd like to speak. Now I would like to speak about the six teachers. Now, during the time of the Buddha, there were the six non-Buddhist teachers. Now, most of you, I think, have already heard these names. So the six teachers here, you've never heard so much about this. You may not have heard of all the six Orthodox schools, but you've heard a lot about the six teachers. When we recite the praises of the Buddha and so forth, there's a lot in those about these six non-Buddhist teachers, right? So in these the six teachers, the six non-Buddhist teachers, or their lamas, or their gurus, there are six people who became the teachers, and the Buddhist scriptures say that they lived in the environs of Rajgir. It's Rajgir, right? So they lived in this area of Rajagir, and they would get students, and so they would gradually gather students or attract students. So they'd go into Rajagir and they'd kind of look for the students. For example, when I go to like in our monasteries now, we have people who go out and looking for monks, right? They go into the Himalayan regions and go out to get more monks for the monasteries, right? As similar. They would stay in the region of Grihana and go and see if they could gather more students. And likewise, these six students was also, they would stay in the palace, go to the palace of King Ajatashatru and speak about speak about philosophical matters. Now, also in the northern tradition, there's the long discourses, which is a section of the sutras. In this, there is a sutra called the results of the spiritual way, and this describes the details that are given. So, excuse me, I'm having some audio problems. So these sutras speak about the results that are come from practicing the spiritual way. What are the results of practice? And the king would ask this question, and then the six teachers would give their answers, and so they're described in the sutra. Now they're given in great they're described for the other six teachers, but they're not described for the Jain Nigranta Gyatiputra. In any case, the sutra, the results of the spiritual way, is very important for researchers, and the reason why is that the six teachers are not described in any other sutra than this text, and so it is very difficult to research them. Now, there are several mentions of them in our scriptures. For example, when we're speaking about them in the like, for example, there is in the Mula, we have the Vinaya Vastu, the Vinaya scriptures of the Mulasarvasavada, which does speak about the six teachers, but it's a rather later text. And so but for researchers, they always want to find the earlier text. It's too late. They're not sure if it's going to occur or not. So when they describe these six teachers, they primarily They use this sutra, the results of the spiritual way, and use that as a source. Now, if we say that we have a lot of uh, because if we say, well, we have a lot of texts about it, and give them to the researchers, then they'd say they wouldn't look at it. They'd say, well, they'd look at, when was the text written? When was it written down? What is the order when was it translated into another tension? And examining all these, then the researchers will examine just the fact that it's in the words, or just that it's a scripture, is not something that they're going to necessarily accept as being authentic. And that's an important point for us to keep in our mind. This is the way the researchers think. It's not our way of thinking. From our perspective, if it's a scripture, we have from the Buddha's words, we have trust in it. But the researchers do not. They look for sources and backup, and then only if they find so do they say, "Oh yes, this is." They feel comfortable saying that this is the words of the Buddha. In any case, there's this sutra. The results of the spiritual way is a very valuable source for the people who are researching Indian thought, and in particular these 6 non-Buddhist teachers. And in particular, now this sutra, the results of the results of the spiritual way, is also a very important sutra in our Buddhist tradition, because we have the northern one that's preserved in Chinese and the southern one preserved in Pali. And when we combine them, they're basically the same. So when we look at it, it says, what are the first of these was a Purushan Kushapa. And they say, well, what is his views? Well, he said that taking life and taking that which is not given, sexual misconduct, and lying are misdeeds, and say that they're not. So if you do them, you will not experience. Here my presentation was wrong. I got too busy and didn't have time to think. It's better for me just to do this in colloquial. So if you commit these, then you will not experience suffering. If you take life, take what's not given, to engage in sexual misconduct or lie, you will not have a result of suffering. Likewise, gathering various many things, or working to gather things, or to help the poor and so forth, they do not bring any result. In brief, he says, there is no past and future lives, no karma, cause and effect, and no arhats. And basically, as a nihilist view, he says there's no karma, cause, and effect. Now, the second one is a non-Buddhist teacher called Makkhali Goshala. So he had a skeptical view. He's always skeptical of everything. He's saying there's probably no virtue and misdeeds. There are probably no parents, no gods, no past and future, no sentient beings. It's all confusion. It's all just like illusion. There's nothing in actuality. And so I said this, and he had this kind of a skeptical view. He's saying in actuality, there's nothing. There's no God. There's no parents, no sentient beings. Everything's all confusion of the mind. All of these appearances happen because of confusion in the mind, but in actuality, there's nothing. And so in basis, this is really a skeptical view. Then there's another one named Ajita Keshakambala. Okay, there's also a mistake here. Now, some of you are taking pictures, so when you're taking pictures, then don't send out the mistaken ones. If you send out the mistaken ones, it's not good. Please send the ones that I've fixed and that are not that don't have mistakes. So Ajita Kambala says that when you die, then when the human life, the four elements will dissolve and cease, and so no matter who you are, then the world has died. No matter who you are, you're going to die. So all of us, whether we're wise or foolish, we're all going to die. There's no one to do this. There's no future lives. So this is a view that the continuum ceases. Now the fourth, the position of the fourth of the teachers. Now the fourth is named. It's Pakuda Kachayana, and this is also mistaken. So Pakuda Kachayana says, is primarily that there aren't any powers, and if practicing the path is pointless, he says. And there's also no really cause by which you can make sentient beings free of stains. There's no cause by which you can exhaust the cause, nor is there any cause that brings the stains. And so we do many different things to achieve liberation, but there's no point to doing all these different things because you can't eliminate them. We talk about obscurations arises without a cause, and so because they don't have a cause, if you want to eliminate them, there's no cause that can eliminate them. It's because initially there's no cause. If there's no cause for them to arise, there's no how can there be any cause to eliminate them? And so he's saying that there's no cause. The fifth is the Sanjaya Balatiputra. He's also a very deceptive view. If he says, is there a spiritual result? He said, no, they don't exist or they don't exist. He's a very deceptive view. He has a very wiggly view. Then the last one is the Nigranta Ghatiputra. Now, his positions are not presented here in the sutra. What it does say here is that the self is prajna by nature. Prajna is me. I am prajna. Prajna is me, he says. So there's nothing that I do not know. So whenever I go or pace or lie or sitting down, no matter what I'm doing, walking or lying down or sitting, I'm in equipoise. And so the prajna is always right there before me, he says. And I see him giving a lot of different praises, but actually he does not explain what his views actually are in this sutra of the results of the spiritual way. Now, if we compare this with the text that is in the text that is in our Mula Sarvastivada scriptures, does describe his positions, but because it's late, and the researchers recognize that it's a later text, and so at that time they say that is not explained here in the sutra of the spiritual way, and so this is a disappointment for the researchers. Now, when you take a look at it, when we compare the teachings of the 62 views spoken about above and the six teachers, and then when you add to them the Charvaka and the Jain religion that we'll be describing below, and we compare all of these, and then we can gain a new understanding. And what that understanding is that the Charvaka school, in actuality, is the school that actually develops that preserves the destructive, skeptical, and nihilistic views that we mentioned before. It is a school that developed among those who held these views. Likewise, the Jain religion. Now, these are primarily. They primarily follow the teachings of the Nigranta Gyatiputra, and they basically are repeating his teachings. Now, his teachings are not taught in this sutra, but his positions described in other sutras are very similar to the positions of the Jain religion found in later scriptures. And so so the Jain religion is basically just upholding the tradition of their teacher Nigranta Gyatiputra. And so for this reason, the ones that are remaining among the six teachers are those of the Nigranta, his tradition, and his followers. Other than that, the traditions of the other traditions teachers did not spread widely. And at the time of the Buddha, they're just recorded in the sutras from the time of the Buddha, but the later people didn't know whether or not there were these six teachers or not. Now, the one that's in a better position is there's the Jain religion. So for that reason, there is some mention, or there's some talk about the Nigranta Gyatiputra, but otherwise there's no discussion of them. And so now we will take a break for 30 minutes. Now, during this age of philosophy, there was a wrong view or an anti-religion, whatever you call it. There's a very extreme tradition that arose. Now, the way this tradition developed is under dispute. The researchers do not agree on the sources. It is also very difficult to say whether the Charvaka appeared before Buddhism or after Buddhism. The reason is because there's no source or manuscript that decisively indicates where it appeared. But it's a very combative school, and they tried to disrupt things. And the time when the disruptions happened was during the time that Buddhism was already spreading. So this is probably during the time of the spread of original Buddhism. Now, who is it who began this tradition, who founded this tradition? The Buddhist texts say that the initial founder of this was a sage named the Eye of the World. However, the non-Buddhists themselves the non-Buddhists do not explain it in this way. The way they describe it is there is a teacher named Devaguru, the third guru of the gods. And they have a rather nice way of explaining it. The way they say this is that he went to the as this Devaguru went to the land of the asuras, the demigods, and and he taught them the wrong views in order to come over to overcome their bounty and pleasures. But this is kind of a story that's kind of mixed in with myth, and so whether it's actually a true story is a different matter. And also, what the non-Buddhists say is that the Charvaka, that the founder of the school, was also known by the Devaguru, was also named the name Brihaspati. So whether you call him Brihaspati or Gurudeva, among the non-Buddhists call him the name of the Devaguru. And that is a very well-known name for him. There's also another name for the school, which is called the hedonist school. Because the Charvaka school primarily wanted to have good things happen in this lifetime. They did not, so therefore they did not take interest in the future lives, and so they only took interest in this lifetime. And so they're called they're called the hedonist school. And so the name in the Chinese is probably a translation of this. Basically means someone who are interested in this life, people who are interested in this lifetime. Now in Tibetan, what's known is Gyangpempa in Tibetan, which is in Sanskrit, which is Lokayati school. And the reason why this is called this is because it has gone a long way. It's gone very far from the upstanding traditions of the world, so it is called the extreme of the world. Now, it is also sometimes said that the Charvaka who developed through the jhana and those who developed through intellection. So the ones through the intellect. So the ones who develop their view through jhana say that there are past and future lives, but that there is no liberation. The ones who developed from intellect say that there's neither past nor future lives nor liberation. So, so among these six. They also explain that it comes from a series of teachers, including the Ajita within this. There's also in the Samkhya it says that there's a text named Sri Jaya Rashibhadra. And so these are some names that are given by the Samkhya teachers. Now, what is the fundamental text of the Charvaka school? We don't have actually a complete text or a complete school of this. And so it's difficult to say that there is we don't have any text left of the Charvaka school, so we can't point to any say that this is the fundamental view. But there are some that have been left that are found in fragments. For example, in Tibetan, we have Kamalashi's commentary on the Tattva Samgraha, which speaks about this. It speaks about this Devaguru, and it gives some of his positions. Likewise, in there are also some words from this from the Charvaka teacher in the auto commentary on the Entering the Middle Way. And so there is still also a Charvaka text in Sanskrit, but it's very difficult to say that there is any root text of the Charvaka school. In any case, whether you're Buddhist or non-Buddhist, so whether you're non-Buddhist or Buddhist, everyone considered it to be the worst among the different views. The Buddhists say that it is the worst of the view, and the non-Buddhists also say it is the worst among the views. An example of how the non-Buddhists considered the worst is like an example is that in the Compendium of All Views by Madhava Acharya, which we mentioned yesterday, he counts 16 different schools. And among these 16 schools, he considers the Charvaka to be furthest from the correct view. And some scholars also say that the Charvakas were probably not actually a philosophical school, because they're called the hedonists, and so for at that time, they're basically materialist traditions of Charvaka. And so probably what happened is there's several materialist traditions, and they're probably all given this by the name Charvaka. So there are some people who also state that. Now, the tenets of the Charvaka school are that primarily that aside from perception, there are no other valence of knowledge, such as inference. They do not accept them. Likewise, they say that the four elements of earth, water, fire, air, and air truly exist, and that everything arises from the four elements. But they also say that the matter and mind arise from the same cause. They're the same thing. They also say that the world was produced by coincidence and luck, that it was not produced by any creator of the world or by any particular power. So basically, the Charvaka view is among the 62 so the Charvaka view collects all of the views, such as the views of no cause, denial of cause, the nihilist views, and so forth, of the described in the 62 views above, and combines them all into one. And so basically, it is like an extreme view. It is among the most extremist of extreme views. There's also a song written by the Charvakas themselves. It's their own song, and what it says in there is that they say it very nicely. At that time, actually, the Charvakas at that time there are many different views that appeared in school. There are many schools that appear in India, and the Charvaka didn't have any sort of order, any distinction saying I say this, or not this. They write with this, and they write their own. They would say their own things. And so at that time, there was no great development like today. There was no TV and no phone, and so no one had any work, and so they would think about things, and they'd have all these different things. They'd think up anything. They had this time, and so they're basically spending all the time looking for logic. And people would just say whatever they thought and say, I think this and I think that. And then they'd spend all their time debating, right? And so there are so many different views at that time, but at that time, the Charvaka was like the worst of these views. So that's recognized as like the worst view of that time. But at that time, the view that was the worst view at that time is actually now the view that most people are here. Most people in the world are actually exactly the Charvaka view. When I say that, when I read the words of the song, then you'll see that. Basically, most people in the world, in the society these days, the view that all that the philosophers consider the worst is actually the view that most people these days hold. So whether we're thinking about the improvement of our view or the evolution of our views or the devolution of our views, it's hard to say. If we look at it from the perspective of the philosophers of the past, we think the way that we think about things, the way we act today, are actually signs of what they would have considered a wrong view. So what it says in this Charvaka song is this: there are no gods, they say. There's no ultimate aim or liberation. There's no liberation. There's no ultimate nature. There's no ultimate nature, they said. Likewise, there are no other worlds than this one, some other worlds or the next life. There are these delightful heavenly realms. They're nothing like that. There are no rituals. There's no karmic cause and effect, no sacrifices. Performing sacrifices and confessing the seeds and all that is just pointless. Performing sacrifices and confessing this, how did that happen? Is that people who don't have any courage and no skills, it's that they made them up in order to pass their days. When they're doing sacrifices, and they're sacrificing animals, they're doing a lot of very cruel things. But what they say is that so we're offering the gods to the animals and saying that they'll be reborn as gods, they say. If you actually think that, then you go sacrifice your, why aren't you going and killing your parents and putting them in the fire? Likewise, what they also say is that it's like in the days there was like they would offer food to the ancestors, their parents or grandparents and so forth, since they would have a ritual of burning the food for that. So when you offer the burnt offering of the food, it's similar to a soft offering, that this fills their stomachs. They're no longer hungry. And the Charvaka say, well, that's no point to that. If this is going to fill the stomachs of your ancestors, your grandfathers, and your grandmothers, and so forth, then there's really no need when you go traveling to carry provisions on it. When you go as you just go, say to your people, say to your family members before you go, just say, okay, you make some nice offerings for me and I'll go. Because if the parents can, if your ancestors can be filled, then if they do it for your point, if they have them do this smoke offering ritual for you, then your stomach will be filled too. Similarly, everyone makes so many offerings to the sacrifices to the gods in the heaven, and they think that the gods can be eaten by the gods in the heaven. And if that is true, then if one person lives on the top floor and the person on the lower floor makes an offering to the person on the top floor, well, look and see, can the person on the top floor actually eat it? It doesn't happen. It's just like superstition. It's like in actuality that can happen. In fact, that can't happen. Like these days, we say the coronavirus. You can't go outside. Like some people, when they live in multi-story buildings, the people on the top floors aren't allowed to go to the bottom floors. So if you have the food delivery people, if you order food, there's no need to order it. There's no need to bring it in. They can just put it on the ground floor and offer it, and then it's fine. Everyone in the upper floor on the upper floors will get it. Another thing that Charvaka said is, if while you're still alive, you need to do everything that's enjoyable. You should just have a good time. There's no next lifetime, and so if you're going to have a good time, you have to do it in this lifetime. You just do everything you want, do everything you think about. Whether you're going to enjoy it or not, you got to do it. And if you can borrow money from a vendor, then you have to borrow it. And then eat as good food as you can, wear the best clothes you can, and do whatever you think of. And then once you're dead, and your corpse is buried underground, you aren't going to be able to give it back. Likewise, they say, there's no next life, they say. Someone dies and their consciousness then continues to go, right? People say this. They say there's no way this can happen. If the consciousness can go to another world, then why doesn't it come back for the sake of the family members who are left behind? If it can go there, if it's going to go to if it's able to go to the other world, next world, then then why isn't it going to come back to see its friends and family? They say this is all made up, it's false. Likewise, for the sake of deceased people, you spend a lot and go to a lot of expense, you go spend a lot of money. There's no point to it. This is basically just the deception of the cruel Brahmins. Basically, it's the Brahmins are just trying to gather wealth for themselves. There's no other benefit. Likewise, you've got the Vedas, the authors of these are like all just terrible people. They're all bad gods. If they call them gods, they're like their spirits. They're bad gods, bad spirits. They're just written. They all got together and wrote them. It's basically they're all just performers. They're the same as our performers. So there's no point in it. And so further, reciting sutras and reciting mantras and reciting rituals is like pointless and meaningless. And so instead, it's better to just do what you enjoy doing. So if that way of thinking is actually very similar to the way many people think these days, people say, oh, forget humility. As long as, do whatever is good, as long as they can get some money. They want to get a car and a motorcycle and a house and everything else, fine. But who cares about the future lives? Whatever happens with liberation, whatever's going to happen the next world happens. There's probably no future lives, they say. So that's how they think, right? So this Charvaka view was in the Indian society at that time was considered extremely extreme, one that had really crossed the boundaries. But in many societies of the world these days, the way most people think is basically that. Generally, the people of those times who held that view probably had been in India for a very long time before. The reason we can say this is there's a story in the Mahabharata. What the Bharata says is that there was a demon who possessed a Brahmin. He made himself look, and he went to a king named Yudhin. This would be Yudhishthira. And he went to see King Yudhishthira. And when he returned from seeing them, he got what he wanted and he came back. And this Brahmin, who was an emanation of the view, said many things that gave people wrong views. And because he had spread so many wrong views, so at that time, the law at that time was that if you were a Brahmin who did this, then you would be executed. And so there was this story that at the end, he was executed at the end. Now, of course, this is just a story, but it's possible that there was a true event behind it. And if it were true, then it would be true then we could say that there are people who did not believe in gods and didn't believe in anything in India from the ancient times, as this is described in the Mahabharata school. So that was a brief description of the Charvaka school. Now I'd like to speak about the Jain religion. Now, normally we call them the naked ascetics, but I don't think that's right, because I will explain the reason later. So it's the Jain religion. The Jain religion appeared, is under doubt. Researchers have different positions, and the researchers have so many different positions, but they're basically two. So one is that many scholars say that the Jain and the Buddhist religions began to spread at about the same time. So that's one position, that they arose around the same time. Now, there are some other scholars who say that the Jain religion was first arose when first Buddhism arose, and then the Jainism arose from within Buddhism. It became like it was derived from Buddhism. It became like it was originally a part of Buddhism. So it's like the Buddhism had appeared, and then that had changed and became the Jainism. And so basically, these are the two different positions. Likewise, if you ask who is the founder of the Jain religion, again there are two different positions among scholars. So many scholars say that the founder of the Jain religion is the Ningaranta Jatiputra mentioned in the Buddhist scriptures as one of the six non-Buddhist teachers. But if we explain it the way the Jain religion explains it themselves, they say that the original founder of the religion was Vardhamana Mahavira. And so he was the founder, this Vardhamana Mahavira. So this Vardhamana Mahavira is the image of him. He's very similar to the Buddha. So some people mistake the Jain teachers and the Buddha teachers. And they think that the Jain teacher is the Buddha, and so they mistake him because he wears similar robes and so forth. And so there are people who mistakenly identify him as the Buddha. So now Vardhamana, is very similar to the life story of our teacher, the Buddha. At the age of 29, he went on the road. You could say going out on the road, or going forth, you could say, and began to practice the path. And after 12 years, he spent 12 years practicing the path, and after 12 years, he achieved the level of a jin, or a victor who has been victorious over the afflictions. He achieved that station, and then he spent the latter 30 years of his life gathering many people and teaching teaching Dharma to people. And in this way, the Jain religion developed. Now, the religion in Sanskrit is called the Jain religion. And so Jain comes from the word for victor. So it basically means, as we say, because you're victorious over the afflictions, you're a victor. So they call the religion the Jain, or the victorious ones. Now, the reason why they're sometimes called the naked ascetics is that actually within the Jain religion, there are two different sects. Now, one of them was naked. And so the name was actually then given to, they were called the naked ones, and that name was given to the entire Jain religion in Tibetan. Now, the way it's described in the Buddhist scripture is that when Buddhism was first developed, there was the Ningaranta Jatiputra teaching the Jain religion in the region of Vaishali. And at that time in Vaishali, the largest religion was the Jain religion. Now later, after Ningaranta Jatiputra passed away, his students split into two sects. They fell into two different parts, and they were always criticizing each other and having just continual disputes amongst themselves. And so this topic is described in detail in the long discourses and also in the Pasadika, or the Sutra of the Freedom from Stains. And so this is written about in these two sutras. So as I just mentioned, after the teacher of Jainism, among his followers, there was a disagreement. So what the dispute arose, first there was a small dispute, but later they split into two completely separate sects. And this probably happened, when you look at it, probably around 200 years later, that it definitely divided into two sects. And so the way that this happened, the way the split into sects developed, was that there was the there was the king Chandragupta. He was the first king of the Maurya dynasty, so Chandragupta. So during his reign in Magadha, there was a great famine in Magadha. And so it's such a great famine that at that time, there was one leader of the Jains who was named Bhadrabahu. So he and all of his students, and he took them all, and they went down to the region of Karnataka. So they went to the south of India. Because there was such a great famine, they went down to the south of India. Now, the rest of the Jains continued to stay in Magadha. And they compiled all the scriptures, the Jain, and held a council and so forth. Now, after the famine was finished, then all the Jains who had gone down to the south of India, so that one group that was in it, they all returned. And when they came back, the two groups, the one that had been from Karnataka and from Magadha, when they reunited, there was a big difference between the two of them. And when they returned and saw each other, they saw that their robes completely didn't match. They had completely different clothing. And the difference in the clothing was that the sect in Magadha said that one should wear white robes. And the Karnataka said that one should stay naked. You shouldn't have any clothes at all, and you should live naked. And so then the question of whether, so was we going to wear clothes or not? Should you be nude or should you wear your clothes? And so that's where they had the dispute. And so the white card was called the white robe, which is Svetambara. And the group that said you should stay naked is called the Digambara. So they said that you should basically wear this cloth. If you say naked, it's not. So they say they wear the directions as their clothes, it said. And so the Digambara, those who wore the directions as their clothes, so what they said is that the teacher Nagaranta did not have a wife. But the Svetambara said that he had a wife, and not only that, he also had a daughter. And so there's these disputes, and also, unlike the Digambara, the Svetambara said that women can achieve liberation, and I think the Digambara did not explain it. And so there are many differences in their tenets, and they have many different explanations in their two different traditions. But these Svetambara and the Digambara do have some share root texts, which is in 50 volumes. And later, when it was all compiled, then the two sects then compiled the text individuals. So there are two different recensions of these two. Now, most of the Indian texts most of the Jain schools are mainly half in Sanskrit and half in colloquial. Likewise, the Jains, they took many different ideas from Buddhism and incorporated them into the Jain religion. So it's like this, either the situation or the way it seems. So in generally, the Jain scriptures were or the time when the compilation of the Jain scriptures was completed, it was probably in the 5th century. So it's basically, that was the time when they're able to completely compile all the scriptures. And so at that time, the Buddhism has spread very greatly. And so if we look at the times, you can see that there are a lot of similarities between the Buddhists and the Jains. And so it seems that the Jains probably took many different ideas from Buddhist texts, included and incorporated them into their own. Now, generally, the Jains texts, if you look at them, you'd think, well, this is like a type of Buddhism. And I think this is a branch of Buddhism. I think it's easy to mistake them. So the scriptures are very similar in that respect. But however, the Jain scriptures that are still extant, so the question is whether the current scriptures of the Jain school are actually the teachings of the teacher, because they were all compiled later. They're compiled over time later. And so it's difficult to say whether they're the actual teachings of the founder of the sect or the religion. It's because the scribes, so in terms of looking at, when we look at the scriptures that were compiled later, it's actually difficult to say what the original way the teacher, the Jain teacher taught. So all the scriptures come from are later, and so one main reason why there's difference between that, where they aren't able to get standard standard beliefs within the two sects, comes from that. Now, generally for the Orthodox schools, if you do not accept in terms of the Jain school does not accept the Veda school. So in that respect, then they're similar to the Buddhists in not accepting the Vedas. They're not an Orthodox schools. Whatever the Orthodox Hindu sects say, they have to accept the Veda schools. Likewise, in the term of asserting that there's no creator of the world, Jain religion is also similar to Buddhism. When we say that saying that there's no creator of the world is saying that there's no creator, but it's not saying that there's no gods. It's not saying that there's no Brahma or so forth, but it's saying there's no all-powerful God who created the world. But if we look at it in terms of the philosophy, there are actually some great differences between the Buddhism and the Jains. The Buddhism basically doesn't have much connection with the Brahmanas, and it's a very separate religion. But the Jain does have many ideas that are similar with the Samkhya school. For example, the Samkhya says that there are the two constituents of the world, the primal nature and the Purusha itself. And so that there are these two. Similarly, the Jain religion says that there are two. Likewise, they also consider the ascetic practice to be extremely important. Within Buddhism, the ascetic practices are not explained to be very important or significant. So there's another difference there. And so in this way, when you look at the Jain religion itself, is different than the six Orthodox Hindu schools. It's like a bridge that can make a connection between the Hindu and the Brahmana schools, because from one aspect, the Jains are accord with the Buddhism. From another perspective, they accord with the Hindu schools, and so for that reason, the Jain scriptures are like the bridge that creates a link in between the Buddhism and the history and the Hindu schools, and so in this way, they're very particular position. And so for this reason, it's a very special school within the different Indian religions and schools. Now, they also talk about the three jewels, or the three jewels. But when they talk about the three jewels, are not the same Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha that we speak about in Buddhism. What they say are the three jewels are right prajna, right faith, and right conduct. These are the three. So right prajna here means distinguishing what is from what isn't. It is the prajna that distinguishes what the nature is and what it is not. It's not the prajna of understanding the five different areas of knowledge. It's being able to distinguish what is the nature from what is not. Now, right faith means being complete and heartfelt belief in the teacher. And so having a great faith in the scripture, having no doubt at all, even in a single word of the scriptures. No, right conduct has five aspects. The first is nonviolence. Now, in the Jain religion, nonviolence is a main part of their practice. The nonviolence is they've come to a level where ordinary people probably couldn't practice it. So the giving up violence is a really important practice for them. For example, in many of Mahatma Gandhi's writings, he said that the view of nonviolence, he was a leader of environments, and what he says is that so his works quote many words of the Jain scriptures. And the reason is that the Jain have such a strong emphasis on nonviolence. And the second one is truth, speaking, not telling lies. The third is not stealing or giving up taking that which is not given. The fourth is chaste conduct, and brahmacharya or celibacy or chaste conduct. And the last one is called aparigraha, which means like not possessing anything. So you only have the things you need, but other than that, you don't wear leopard clothes, you don't enjoy sensory pleasures, you give them up. You give up all other things. And so these are the five aspects of right conduct that they teach. And so that's a very brief introduction to the Jain religion. So in this way, we've generally talked about the Vedas in general. We've talked about the Vedic philosophy. I've given a bit of an introduction to all of these. So from tomorrow, we'll be speaking about the topic of Buddhism. And so we only have 4 days to speak about the Buddhist school. And I'll say as much as I can in those 4 days, but I'm not going to rush through it. I'm going to take my time to go through the Buddhist tradition. If I try to rush through everything, thinking that I should get to secret mantra, then I think that would actually make an obstacle to actually teaching the topic of Buddhism well. So I'm not going to rush to try to speak about mantra, but instead take my time to speak about Buddhism. So from the day after tomorrow, I'll speak about when the Buddha is. So this is the biggest problem. What century was the Buddha alive in? This is not just a problem for Buddhism at all. This is the biggest complication in any of Indian history. Whenever you're studying Indian history, the dates are a big problem. And the problem is because the people of India didn't have any interest in recording dates or recording history. The Mahabharata is like sort of like a mixture of history and stories and myths and all mixed together. And if you look at it, is this a real story? It's difficult to say. So which aspect is real history? Which part is like a story of realization? Which is part of a myth? It's all difficult to distinguish. Also, the Buddhists had actually they were very skilled in poetry, and they wrote everything as if it's real, as living. You read it, you feel like it's exciting and alive. They write it in this way, so when you read it, so I know what's true and false is really, who can tell? So the most important, the most difficult, I think, for people researching Indian history is dates. So everyone's saying, oh, they have to just sigh. It's like they have to beat their heads with a hammer. No matter how many times you hit yourself on the head or sigh, there's no day, so you can't say anything. There's no other way but to just go and to look in the old histories. And so the states of our teacher, the Buddha, are not at all certain. There are many different positions. Even among our Tibetans, forget about others, only among us Tibetans, when we speak about the dates of the Buddha passing, there are 7 or 8 different positions. And the difference between them is some of them say that it's a few hundred years ago. I don't know if it's 1,000, but there are differences of hundreds of years between them. It's not just like 1 or 2, but it's like differences of centuries. Now, all of these people are saying these are all well respected and well known. And people who have very well known names in history. And so to say it's not that, it's difficult, of course. To say it is, that's also difficult. So the Buddha is one person. He only appeared at one time. It's impossible that he appeared in 2 or 3 different centuries. And so it's a difficult issue. But I will speak about this tomorrow. So today I will leave it there today. Now, today in particular is the Sakya Trizin Rinpoche. It's his birthday. I've had some opportunities to receive empowerments and traditions from Sakya Trizin Rinpoche, and he's come to the Kaji Mulam and gave us all teachings and empowerments, and we had this good fortune. And so I'd like to take this opportunity today. I will recite a long life prayer to the Sakya Goma. And then as we recite it, we should think that we're reciting it for all the masters of all the teachings to live long, in particular for the Sakya Trizin. He's one of the great masters and scholars of the Tibetan tradition. And in historical terms, in terms of his activity, in all respects, he is a Lama who is really different than any other. And so if he lives long and his activity flourishes, then Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism and all sentient beings will increase and our merit will increase. And so we'll recite this now. So now please show the long life prayer.
사진 공간 제베 장년 진 대진 주게 개보사야 개연 개zen 배도 바웨세 오르소 갱가면 되베 칠레 산베 왕게 개보 다르세와 야와 레라 야베 제바 Sina Jave Shiba De Daige Yonsue Gemba Trabe Gensen Penjuro Sambe Zemro Dasun Ba Duye Doje Shangwan Mizuji Gege Bado Yome Den Yuruji Nagaji Suenda Bese jime zhongle beba ye ngawan gwengi dongre jime sa jin gonggan zebe zhangye jin di jin juge gebo sa kya 君给人把多把月色，或者说见个门对月之类。三别忘给给我到时我叫我来了给月这吧。心那这位西巴的大给用水见把这边见人。便知道三别怎么了大声把对也多谢将我迷住，给给把多有没定就如今。不是前面中的白白也，俺外看见断绝前面，发现公干这边常年间，提前去给不撒家，开源给人把的多白为些，或者说给个本对之类，上边忘给不打字。叫我来了，叫月在吧，谁拿着位西巴的大给用水给把茶杯给谁？便知道上边怎么了大声把对给多吉祥话秘书，给把多杨梅点就如鸡。